Hey, what's up? Welcome back. You are watching part 3 of 3 in a tiny mini series about asynchronous programming with JavaScript. In the first episode, we talked about set timeout and set interval and how sort of JavaScript executes code. If you wanted to head over, you can take a look at that one now. In part 2, we talked about promises. So we talked about how you can create your own promises using the promise constructor function and the promise object inside of the browser, and how they start off as pending and they work their way to either fulfilled or rejected. And in the last episode, we went over how to use the fetch API and calling .then to get the result of some promise. In this episode, I want to talk about async and await. So async and await are two keywords that were added to the JavaScript language pretty recently. I think these were in ES7 or maybe even like in a more recent version. And so what we're going to do is we're going to modify our current API call. So let's go through and recall how this works. So we are making a call out to this API that gives us back some weather, specifically air quality. Right now, I'm based in northern Nevada. We have a fire that is just north of us called the Bootleg Fire. We have another fire that's just south of us called the Tamarack Fire. And I was walking my dog this morning, and as we were walking, there was just tons of ash. A car drove by, and I could see the ashes just sort of like fly up into the air. There's ashes everywhere. The visibility is very low. The air quality is just garbage, but the dog's got to get out for a walk, right? So what I wanted to do was use this as an example for fetching some air quality results and displaying them on the page. And so at this point right now, what we've got is a simple little app where we can refresh the browser here. We see loading, and then we see the current air quality indication. 239 is very high. It's like a really very unhealthy air quality. So yeah, super disappointing, but it should give us something to talk about here when we're going through JavaScript. So what's happening is we have this URL where we pass in the city and state and an API key. And we're making use of the fetch API. So this is something that the browser gives us to make an API call or fetch some data with an HTTP request, and it's returning a promise. And in the last episode, we talked about how you can use .then and .catch to handle the results of that promise, to take some actions when that promise ultimately resolves or is rejected down the line some other time in the future. So this is how we respond to an asynchronous event completing. And so what we want to do now is let's refactor this to use async and await. So when a function returns a promise, we can put the await keyword in front of it. So await means we're going to wait for the result of that promise at this point in the code, and then we're going to continue execution. So our code is actually just going to stop at this point and wait for the resolution, the successful resolution of the promise that's inside of the fetch API. By using await, we don't actually pass any callbacks into .then. We're not passing any callbacks into .catch. We are instead going to use a try catch, and we're also going to use just a more like imperative programming style where we can say do this, then do this, then do this. So here we're going to call await, and that should wait for the fetch to come back. So this is actually going to fail, and we'll see why in just a second. So we'll refresh the page, and here we see uncaught syntax error. Await is only valid in async functions. All right, so in order to use await, we need to be inside of an asynchronous function. So the way that we can create an asynchronous function is we can create a normal function, or let's say fetch weather, and we're going to put our await call inside there. So in addition to writing our function like this, in order to make it async, we need to use a modifier. So the modifier is async. So we put the word async in front of where we say function. That modifies this function to become an asynchronous function. Now our asynchronous function here, we can just call normally fetch weather. And the reason why we want to call it is because if we don't call it, then it doesn't actually execute the stuff that's in here. So we need to wrap all of our code that's using await inside of this async function. So we're going to create a new function called fetch weather. We're going to make it an async function, and then inside of fetch weather, we're going to say await. And let's actually console.log. So we'll say here we'll say console.log before defining fetch weather. Okay, and then we'll say after defining fetch weather, and we'll say before calling fetch weather, and then we'll say after calling fetch weather. So that you can see the order of operations here. And then inside here, we'll say console.log fetching weather data. And then we'll say done fetching. Okay, so that we can see the order of these events that are going to happen. So we'll say refresh. And so we see before defining, after defining, before calling, fetching the weather data, before calling. So we see before calling, and then we see fetching. So as soon as we call fetch weather, it's actually going to execute that function normally, as we expect. So it's calling fetch weather data. And then as soon as it gets to here, this is where the asynchronous call happens, okay? So now we're going to see after calling fetch weather data. So we see this return first. So this is printed to the console first, because as soon as we call await, this function sort of stops executing and it says anything that's after this, consider that code that needs to run after this callback, or I'm sorry, after this promise resolves. So consider anything after this await sort of as part of the success, or part of the .then, or part of the bits that need to be called after the promise is resolved, okay? So because we're pausing here to wait for some data to come back from the API, none of this code is going to execute, and we're just gonna say that, okay, everything after that is gonna be completed in part of another call stack execution. From this point forward, the rest of this code is going to be added to that call stack that says, as soon as the promise for fetch is resolved, pick up this function where we left off and continue executing it later. Okay, so because we're saying like at this point we're not done resolving this callback, because we're saying at this point this promise is not resolved, just continue execution after fetch weather. So then here we see after calling fetch weather. So we see after calling fetch weather, then after the weather API resolves, and that's going to resolve in some time. So like if we look at the API here, we see this is actually 372 milliseconds. So that took 372 milliseconds. Later, the API returns, and then we call done fetching weather data. At this point where we call await, we are waiting for the data to come back from this API so that the promise can resolve. And as soon as the promise is resolved, then we'll continue execution for the rest of this function. How do we actually use the data that's returned here? Well, we can, in front of await, we can assign the return value from this fetch call into a value. So we can actually say like const response is equal to await fetch URL. So this is going to be the value that the promise is resolved with. So that's going to be the return value that the promise was resolved with. Down here, this is sort of the same thing as results. So let's actually call this results. And that'll give us like a similar look. In fact, like let's also call like fetch URL, because this is going to be basically the same thing in two different ways. So that at the top here, we'll do the async version, async await version, and down here we'll have the promise version. So when this promise is resolved with results, those results will be stored into this variable. All right, so I'm going to remove the console logs for now. Okay, so we're going to see results. If we console.log results, we are again going to see this is the response object. So if we refresh the page, we see this is the response object. And again, we can look at all of the stuff about the response object. Recall that the response object has another method on it called JSON, and .json returns yet another promise. So we can actually await that call also. So here we can say const weather data is equal to await results.json. So results.json is going to return another promise that we can then await again. And we can, when results.json's underlying promise is resolved, the value that the promise is resolved with will be set to weather data. So weather data will contain the value that the JSON promise resolved with. And then we can just console.log weather data here. Okay, so we can refresh the page, and now we see weather data at the bottom. We see that it was successful. We see the data for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how we can actually dig in and pull out the AQI for the pollution from this API. This makes it much more readable. So by using async and await, we can sort of just write like this very like step-by-step code as you walk down the execution of the code, right? So even though fetch is doing something asynchronous, we can plop an await in front of it and then wait for those results. And then only once this promise has resolved will it start executing this next step here, where we're going to call results.json. And again, we can use that weather data to set the air quality index equal to its value. And we can just do that like this. Okay, so as soon as we get the weather data back, we're going to drill into the object's data's current pollution AQI, and we're going to set that value as the inner text for our air quality paragraph tag that's at the top. So now loading should show our value for the weather data. Weather data. Okay, refresh the page, and now we see 239. So when we refresh, we see loading for a split second because it's going to make that API call. And then as soon as all those promises resolve and those awaits are resolved and they get back the data from the API, then it's going to update the UI with our return value. Now, what happens in the case of using async await? What happens if we have a failure? Again, in the previous episode, we just messed with the URL here and we added blah so that we could see what happens if it fails. If we refresh this page, now at the bottom here, we see a bunch of errors, but our loading screen did not update. And we see an uncaught in promise type error, failed to fetch. So this is the error that we sort of want to handle. When you're using await, if there's a chance that the method you're calling will result in a failure, then instead of using .catch, which we did with the promise version, instead of using .catch, we're going to use try catch. That is like the standard try catch tools that you have inside of JavaScript to try something and then handle an error. So we're going to say try catch e, and inside of our try block, we'll also just do these two things also so that we can print out the result. And if there was an exception, then we'll update our air quality tag to say like failed to fetch weather data. All right, so let's refresh our page. And now when it fails, it says fails. Like first when we refresh, it says loading. And then as soon as that API request fails because the URL is invalid, we get this message failed to fetch weather data. And again, down here at the bottom, we see a more detailed error message. But at the end of the day, this is what we really wanted, was using this try catch mechanism in order to handle any of the exceptions that are raised inside of these promises where we're using await. So similar to our catch call down here where we're getting the reason back, this exception here will have the reason why this promise failed. So anytime that you're using await, we want to wrap it into try catch. If there's an exception anywhere in any of these 4 lines, our catch will handle those here, and then we can respond that we failed to fetch the weather data. So this is how you use async await. There's another little trick that I wanted to show, and that is that often instead of having to like create your own async function like this, another way you can do this is by creating an immediately invoked function expression. So you can say, okay, let's if we wanted to create a new function called like f, right? And as soon as we've created this function, if we want it to call itself, what we can do is we can say, let's wrap it in parentheses so that it evaluates the expression that's inside the parentheses. So this is the same thing as using like parens around like math expressions. If you're doing like a times b plus c, and you want to make sure that one of those is going to evaluate first, you can put parentheses around it. And by putting parentheses around it, you sort of force it to execute. So we're going to use parentheses to evaluate the expression that defines the function. And then after the parentheses, we can put another set of parentheses, and these actually call the function. So this is called an iffy. Actually, it should be like function f. So it's called an iffy. No, it's IIFE. So immediately invoked function expression. So this is called an immediately invoked function expression. The reason why we have these parens on the outside is just to evaluate that function definition. And the reason we have the parens on the inside is so that we actually execute the function. And there's like a couple different weird syntaxes. You can put a bang in front of this. So like not function, that's another way to evaluate, force a function to evaluate. And so using this, that will define the function, and then we'll call it down here. Another way you can do this is by putting the parens on the outside, and then these parens on the inside will execute the function. A bunch of different ways to do it. But with the arrow syntax, you can also define an immediately invoked function expression like this. And again, we can use this async function modifier in front of it. So we can say async like this, and this creates an immediately invoked async function expression, which we can use instead of our fetch weather situation. So let's just like copy this and paste it in here. So this is an alternative to using fetch weather. We're just wrapping it inside of this iffy. And now when we refresh, we see the same result. If we fix our URL here and put blah, take blah back out and refresh, again, we see 239. That's the result we expect. So this is one way, is using an iffy. I think iffies are a little iffy, a little bit confusing for when you're just getting started. So another alternative is waiting for the DOM to be fully loaded. And so there is an event that you can listen for on the document. So we can say document.add event listener DOM content loaded. And when the DOM content is all loaded for the page, you generally will pass this a function or an event handler. So we can say this is called E, and E is going to have the event for the DOM loading. But you might also just put the async modifier on this callback, and now you have now you have a function expression that's going to evaluate when the DOM is fully loaded and is async. So what's nice about this is you always will have you'll always be inside of an async function. So the await keyword will always work, and also the DOM will be fully loaded. So I like using this way just because it's sort of like two birds with one stone, right? You'll have all of the content, all of the tags will be on the page for the DOM, and also you'll be able to use the await keyword, but we should get the same result here. Add event listener is not a thing for document. Add event. I can't spell today. Okay, so now we see 239. That's what we expect. And now, yep, so there's a couple different ways that you can create async functions when you just want to use await inside of the context of your simple script tag that's on the page. All right, so that's it for asynchronous programming. We talked about set timeout, set interval. We talked about promises. We talked about async and await. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this little mini series on asynchronous programming with JavaScript. If you did, I'd really appreciate a like so that other folks can find the content. That's how we can grow the channel. Also, if you're interested in seeing more web development content about JavaScript, Ruby, Rails, or even C#, .NET, PHP, some of these other languages, I would love your subscription. Thank you again so much for your time and attention, and we'll see you in the next one.